this is almost, I'm just glad to get this sort of out there, and like everywhere I speak, it's just amazing to pass along this, knowledge. This is about this book itself and in the research alone was about a decade in the making. Um, Accumulating just the life of a fascinating figure, William Trent, who, in not only in New Jersey, but also in this area of Pennsylvania. And as you can see, and as you'll see today, how influential he was, not only in, like I said, in New Jersey or in the 18th century at the time, but also in this area that we're sitting and listening to today, known today as Carlisle. So as you can see on the right here, this is a letter from another partner and sort of trader of William Trent named John Fraser. That's how he addressed his letter at the time in the 1760s, writing to Trent when he was residing at the time. Actually, right here off of East Street, the corner of East Street in Ohio, and High Street, as I'll show you in a little bit here in Carlisle. And also, this is one of the few select that was intact of William Trent's seal. I was able to, if you're able to journey afterwards, I actually had it molded into a thing to show people what exactly the seal looked like. So getting into on who William Trent was, if you notice the last name, his father, Judge William Trent, was basically a partner of William Penn and Isaac Norris and other famous names there in Philadelphia. That's his signature there, his father's signature. He would be the reason they would move to, after they sort of evading the law in Philadelphia of unpaid debts and different things, would move onto his land, about 1,000 acres worth, in western New Jersey. At that time was known as Falls of the Delaware. And as he resided there, built a house, ran the mills, different things there, the settlement became known as Trent's Town. Eventually, it would be shortened, and it's as it is today as the New Jersey capital, Trent, New Jersey. And if you visit, today, you can actually visit and see exactly where this William Trent that I'm talking about, where he would grow up and was born there in Trenton, New Jersey. This Judge William Trent would marry Mary Coddington, and you see this signature. This was when she was 13 years old. This is on a wedding certificate. She grew up Quaker and at Quaker weddings. If you were attending that Quaker wedding, you and whoever attended your reception or celebration had to sign, and they were acting as witnesses. So if you were able to sign, you did. So this was a teenage Trent's mother signing, Mary Coddington there. That was in Philadelphia in 1706 at the time. So it was fascinating to find that on one of the certificates that I was finding at the time. So it looks to be that this William Trent, the son, was born in Trenton, New Jersey. Based on my research, it's hard to tell exactly. There isn't actually a baptism record, but based on his apprenticeship and how it was done with the Pennsylvania and New Jersey laws, it's estimated to be, at least I narrowed it down to at least the month and year, either March or April of 1722. And he, like I said, he grew up in Trenton, New Jersey. That's the house that still resides today. That's the birthplace of William Trent, and it's the house his father built. It began building there he purchased the land about 1715, would start building by 1716, and it was completed by 1719. And it still stands there today. If you actually take 95 into Trenton, you can actually see it from the interstate. As soon as you get off before you get to downtown Trenton. It's a fascinating building that still stands, a Georgian structure today. So at that time, Trent growing up there in Trenton, New Jersey, by the time he reached his teenage years, he was able to use those connections. I mentioned his mother being at a wedding, and this wedding was between her cousin, who were the Shippens. For those of you not familiar with the Shippen family, very prominent in Philadelphia. Edward Shippen III, who was her first cousin, would eventually settle sort of west and build a settlement there in the 1730s. That became known as Shippensburg. And at that time, William Trent would then apprentice under Edward Shippen III in Philadelphia, where he would learn the mercantile trade there for a few years, learning under him. And also James Logan, who was the partner of Edward Shippen at the time. in the late 1730s, early 1740s. In fact, in 1738, there was even a instance where Benjamin Franklin's print shop had a record that Trent's mother, Mary Connington, would eventually arrive at the print shop there on Market Street in Philadelphia and purchase a Latin book to give to Edward Shippen, so he could learn to use Latin, because that was very prominent in learning the mercantile trade and writing deeds and different things. And this right here is the only known sketch, or basically, of Edward Shippen III, and this is at Winterthur Museum in Delaware. They have the only known. His son would actually have a portrait that's always mistaken for him, Edward Shippen IV. But Edward Shippen III, this is the only known sort of portrait of him. And if you recognize the name too, his granddaughter would be Margaret Shippen, also known as Peggy, the wife of Benedict Arnold. And this is one of the things I stumbled across to go back to the apprenticeship. This was in 1742, and it basically proves, they weren't sure exactly the years of the apprenticeship, but it looked to be from about 1737 or 1738 till about 1743, but it wasn't. It looks in this one of 1742 that William Trent writes at the bottom, "Encountered my master, Edward Shippen," meaning that he was still at that time working under Edward Shippen, handling receipts. This was found in the Library of Congress in the Shippen papers. But eventually, after working this and learning the mercantile trade, he would eventually become a clerk and then start handling not only Shippen's books in Philadelphia, would eventually start managing basically his frontier depot, he called it, or his supply depot in the settlement of Shippensburg. And at that time, Shippensburg was sort of the last known depot at that point until you headed west into what was known then as the Ohio country or the Western country. And it's hard to believe because we think of Shippensburg in Pennsylvania today, and it doesn't seem far west at all. But back then that was, and Shippen having this depot was sort of like the last Walmart in the middle of nowhere. He could charge whatever he wanted to because he knew traders and such that were going west would buy it. And it would be that Trent would work here and manage this, handling all the books. And we know this because Joseph Shippen, the son of Edward Shippen III, would actually write a letter, and this was one of the things he would write, saying, "I'll handle it all," to Mr. William Trent at Shippensburg, and you can see the spelling there. At the time, this was in 1745, and it would also be here at this time in Shippensburg where Trent would meet another trader who had just lost and been forced from his property up towards outside of what would be present-day Cleveland, Ohio, a man named George Crowan. And that would be, they would first meet, and it would be then, it would hit off immediately. They would, in October, about the fall there of 1745, I mentioned that letter back there of Shippen talking about that. That was in May of 1745. So only a few months later, Trent and Crowan would eventually purchase 354 acres. At the time that, we know today is Cumberland County. Back then, at least, until Cumberland County was formed, this appears in the Lancaster County records. As you can see, this is a map done by Lewis Evans in 1749. But it shows, you can see the word Crowan right there, and the arrow is pointing to the house right around the Conondogua Creek there. And basically, it would be there that he and Crowan would go on the property there. If you want to see a modern day interpretation, this is the property here. The 401 Skyport Road was where the house and still is there. The original cabin that was built was part of a modern day house on Skyport Road. We did a dedication, believe it or not, back in 2020. It's for a historic sign to show where George Crowan's trading house was, and this would be also where Trent was living at the time on the property here. And that's that whole property you see here in that weird bending thing around the creek. That was all the 354 acres to show today. It's a housing development. Really, the creek itself, if you look at the modern day, or the historical record of the time compared with the modern, there's not much changed. But in the midst of all this height of the fur trade and them establishing themselves of this property and having a barn, and they opened up a tanning yard at one point, the conflict with the French broke out. Now, it's not the French and Indian War. That was not till the 1750s. But in the 1744, there was basically the War for Austrian Succession, but in New England and just south of Canada there, it became known as King George's War. It lasted about 4 years, from 1744 to 1748. And it would be then that the king wished to drive out the French subjects there that were starting to basically come down from Canada into New York and establish outposts and different things. So in 1746, the summer of, he wanted Pennsylvania to be involved as well. They would have 4 100-man companies, basically in His Majesty's service. They were sort of independent companies, not necessarily militia, would be paid directly by the king. And Trent was chosen as one of these captains. Would be sent. So at the height of this fur trade and the booming business that they were trying to do, excuse me, Trent would become and be commissioned a captain in King George's War there in 1746. And at the time, just to show you here, this is a bounty that he would write. He would train. By the fall of 1746, Trent would end up, these 4 men that would be running these companies would eventually train these men certain cities and taverns outside of Philadelphia on their way to hopefully head to Philadelphia. I'm sorry, from Philadelphia to New York, up to Albany. Then eventually Trent would be stationed right outside of Saratoga, present-day Saratoga, New York, in a place called Fort Clinton. But in Frankfort there, the modern day that we know today, there'd be a tavern called the Sign of the Black Bear that Trent would train the men and known the manual of arms there for a good month or two there in the fall of 1746. And this was a request to get the bounty and the promise that he was supposed to give to the men there. But after Trent would eventually do his service of over 500 days worth, just under 2 years there of service in the king's service, he would return home and basically get back into the fur trade. But this time, getting back up his partnership with George Crowan, but also adding a middleman, basically a protege of Richard Hockley. And they would form basically a mercantile firm in 1748. And they would receive, Trent would actually go to London and receive some kind of money from several merchants right in London itself, including Thomas Penn. And at this time, the firm would have a symbol that they would type in on most of the letters and all their supplies that they would send to most of the Indian towns. And by 1752, early 1750s even, there wasn't an Indian town in the Ohio Valley, let alone the Ohio country, that didn't have this insignia on supplies. At one point, I think Crowan and Trent announced that they had at least 7 or 8 trading houses operating from the Hockley, Trent, and Crowan firm, while Hockley would handle all the books there in Philadelphia at his dry goods store. But in this same thing as this is happening here, Cumberland County gets formed there, and basically late 1749, by 1750 here, it was right around the time of that dual calendar thing, because it's listed, at least in the Cumberland County records, that Trent is elected, as well as George Crowan. On March 10th, 1749, they become district justices of the newly formed Cumberland County. And so as it goes from 49 into 1750, Trent would then be operating in district justice, handling disputes and marriage licenses in Cumberland County. But he would operate out of this building here. This right here is Widow Piper's Tavern in Shippensburg. That was the first courthouse before it came here to Carlisle, before Carlisle was built. And this, believe it or not, is the desk and chair that was one of the originals that operated in the actual tavern and became the first courthouse of Cumberland County. So it is quite possible that Trent might have used this to conduct business on the second floor. But as we get into 1750s with the formation there of Carlisle, they had a lottery system, and Trent would have lot number 3 out of the 300 some lots that were available. He didn't build on right away, but he did do several things, especially in this region. As you can see, he ended up helping a sawmill. This was by 1751 along Mountain Creek there at the foot of South Mountain. And you can see at this time, this is a map from the 1770s, and you can see their names there. Trent's Mountain right there. This was right at Mountain Creek where they had the lumber mill built, and then also the gap through the mountain. At one point, the gap through the mountain on the North Mountain was called Crowan's Gap. The bottom through the South Mountain was called Trent's Gap. So you can just see the two basically early residents of Cumberland County and Carlisle there. And like I said, the foot of South Mountain is what would be present day Mount Holly Springs. And you can see the arrow there. And this today is the Mountain Creek in the vicinity of where that sawmill was built. And this is the gap in the mountain at least known then, eventually by 1770, known as Trent's Gap, in present-day Mount Holly Springs. But as he established stuff here and applied for those lots, he went back to using his district justice ability. And in 1750, would basically help a group of most of the district justices, many men that were very prominent to this area. Just to name a few that I'm even showing you on here, and it was Trent, there was George Crowan, there was Benjamin Chambers, of course, the founder of Falling Spring, and then eventually Chambersburg. There was also Matthew Dill, eventually Dillsburg. There were also several others. George Stevenson would also be involved. He would start Pine Grove Furnace. So there were so many district justices in this early thing of Cumberland County here. And Trent at that time, and you can see here, this is a historic sign marked today, but it was known then as they drove these settlers out to provide the land for the Indians. Today, if you're familiar with that area, especially closer to basically Franklin and the Fulton County areas, that's what it's known today as burnt cabins because of those district justices going in 1750 and driving the settlers out, arresting them, and doing it for the natives, so they could the land that was promised to them in the summer of 1749. Now Trent itself, after helping with this, would return, and he eventually had be listed in the tax records, and by 51 would have basically a plantation in Middleton Township along Latour Spring, about 3 or 4 miles east of Carlisle. And this would be one of the deeds later when he would sell to George Campbell, mentioning this, situated in Middletown Township. But this was exactly the plantation that he would have it was built by about 1751. There are numerous things that he would order from Philadelphia, including a mirror with gilded borders. He would thing, and even pay people to make sure it passed through customs and that it was protected and it didn't break on the way back to Carlisle. But eventually, using this, he would live there. George Campbell, this name here, eventually towards the end, would be the Register of Wills in Philadelphia. And he is the reason why the majority of these wills from the 1750s till almost turn of the century, 1780s, 1790s, still exist today because he registered them all in the county of Philadelphia. And that would be the person you would go to when you were filing a will. Trent himself would even do this in 1784. But Trent also, being that he was such a prominent in the area, district justice, resident of Cumberland County, would be elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly as a representative. He'd be one of 2 people represented from Cumberland County and be sent in the fall of 1751 then to the Pennsylvania State House. Of course, we know that today is Independence Hall. And that's where they would meet. They would meet Benjamin Franklin, William Franklin. And I mentioned William Franklin because back in King George's War, Ben's son, William, was a teenager then, 16 years of age, was actually with Trent as a teenager, 16 years of age, and went north into New York with William Trent. So there was a relationship already between the Franklins, and there will be more as you'll see here. But not only what's important about this being here at the Pennsylvania State House, that year in 51, Trent was part of the voting to build a new State House bell to bring to the State House that would arrive in the fall of 1752. This bell here, the Liberty Bell, that wouldn't be known until later as that, but it's still prominent in itself, knowing full well that that's what Trent was a part of, at least helped vote it in, as well as several other members of every county there represented at the time in 1751. So by the middle of 1750s, known for his prominence, Trent would become the factor for the Ohio Company. This was the largest land agency at that time, almost in the world. It was run by Northern Neck, wealthy men from Virginia, but eventually expanded to Maryland. And ironically, the first factor for the Ohio Company, when it was established in 1748, was named Hugh Parker, and he was an apprentice with Edward Shippen III at the same time as Trent. So you can think about, there were only really 2 factors for the Ohio Company in their existence from 1748 to almost 1769. Both were apprentices of Edward Shippen. So it was pretty impressive. And Trent was always known for his, not only his penmanship, but also his account keeping and handling the books. So he was sort of a shoo-in when it came to replace the deceased Hugh Parker there. And by the fall of 1752, it would become a factor, would change his residence, where the Ohio Company would have their warehouse and houses. It would be there. He would live there from 1752 to about 1755. It would also be the same place that George Washington would come through to find Christopher Gist on his way up to the French forts there in the fall of 1753. And Trent being the factor, their main thing, knowing that the French weren't leaving this Ohio Valley, Trent would then be offered on this major expedition and help fund it using Ohio Company funds. And talking with these Six Nations and the Indians there, would build a fort there at the Forks of the Ohio in the spring of 1754. But unfortunately, not even 2 or 3 months later, by mid-April, the French would come down the river outnumbering Trent's men and eventually push those men out and build their own fort known as Fort Duquesne. This was the original order saying commission, and George Washington was also commissioned to handle soldiers to protect these workmen and traders that Trent was bringing in. Trent was considered the full commander of this expedition and basically supervisor for this fort at the Forks of Ohio, but that was on the original orders in 1754. And as you know today, that site of the Forks of Ohio is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The fort would have been here, where you see where the fountain was. In fact, if you visit Pittsburgh today, those familiar, you can still see the outline of what they believe was Fort Duquesne, the French fort, built just months immediately. In fact, they even used, it's referenced by the summer there after Trent's men would surrender there in April of 1754, that, believe it or not, the French admired the handiwork and actually kept the lumber and some of the houses that were built at the time for Fort Duquesne. And Trent would find himself, believe it or not, 4 years later, being involved back with the fur trade and returning home. But 4 years later, he found himself once again joining an expedition to try to take the Forks of the Ohio, and this time trying to take it back from after his men would leave there the first time. And he would go under this man named General John Forbes, and he would join this Western country expedition mainly because of his deeds of what happened at Fort Loudon, Pennsylvania. It would be at the time there were Pennsylvania and Virginians garrisoned there at Fort Loudon. The Indians wanted their supplies. Trent was on hand to hand the supplies to the natives, and the natives wanted them right away, even though there was a rainstorm. Trent said he'd wait till the next morning. The Indians burst in, started using tomahawks and screaming, trying to take the supplies. The soldiers immediately tried to call to arms and tried to drive the Indians out. Trent got in the middle of them, told them, "It'll be fine. I'll give the Indians their supplies in the morning." Everybody went handled it fine. The what could have been possibly something at the beginnings before the Forbes expedition became even a thing, as they were still assembling there in Philadelphia. It would be at this time that Trent would be considered then sort of a hero for this, because of making sure there wasn't bloodshed or any type of at this time tensions between them and the Six Nations, and even between the Cherokee. So at this time, Trent would join then. Forbes would recommend him be the assistant superintendent of Indian affairs in the expedition under Abraham Bosworth, and by this he would follow the whole expedition there to reclaim the Forks of the Ohio, a place that then eventually, you can see the plan of this is Fort Duquesne, would eventually be named by Forbes as Pittsburgh, eventually becomes Pittsburgh at that time. And Trent would be on hand, probably a bittersweet to see this on hand, being that 4 years earlier he had watched, had heard his men, at least at the time, have to vacate the Forks to the French. In 1761, though, as a fort is being built there in Pittsburgh, and what became the early, basically by 1761, Fort Pitt, he would eventually, Trent would be living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with his family at the time. But by 61, would get a 2-story stone house. It's listed in the advertisements and in a deed, a log stable there on East Street in Carlisle from Joseph Steinman. And this is the house that still resides today. It's right at the corner of East and High Street. The address is 7 North East Street in Carlisle. Eventually, he would sell it to George Crone before he sailed to England. But this would be the house that he would basically rent in 1761. Basically, it's listed in the Cumberland County tax records as renting. But the majority of his children and everything would live there up till 1769. And I said he sailed to England. Eventually, he would leave this. His wife would have their final a son named John that would be born in this house, as well as 2 others before him. And eventually, they would move to Trenton, New Jersey, at least where he felt that they could be safe while he sailed to London. As you can see here, this is the baptismal record, or a copy of one, the original. On the bottom here, you can see John Trent was born here April the 21st, 1768, 10 o'clock in the morning. and baptized, at least at the time, by the Reverend William Thompson. Reverend William Thompson would eventually move and become a rector in Trenton, and this is where it's believed that Trent had his family, his wife, and kids at that time live possibly in the rector's house in Trenton. There are numerous letters he writes from London where he was afraid that the letters were being read at the time being sent, so he would send them through packet ships through New York, eventually to Trenton, and then he'd address them Reverend William Thompson. And they were inside the letter was written to his wife. And believe it or not, too, he also was, at least towards this end of the 1760s, he was elected as a church warden for St. John's Church in Carlisle. That's the sort of modern day picture today of that church that started, basically the congregation started in 1752. But Trent would be listed as a church warden. This is the original record here. You can see Trent here, along as church wardens here, in debts owed, at least as Robert Guthrie. You can see this name too, Paul Pierce. Paul Pierce, believe it or not, was a very trader, prominent ex-employee of the Ohio Company. He would also be at the Forks of the Ohio with Trent there. He had numerous trading houses there, but also be listed in several receipts and letters when the French came down the river there in 54. And it's amazing over the course of his life how many men or women involved with William Trent at the time would be throughout their lives. 20, 30 years down the line, you're still seeing these names pop up with them in residence. So by that time, with basically the completion of Fort Pitt, Trent living at the time before he even moved officially to and rented that house in Carlisle, he would join a Lancaster firm under Joseph Simon. I mentioned about renting the house from Joseph Simon, who had that house built. Joseph Simon would be part of two others, Levi Andrew Levy and David Franks, would all be men that were helping supply the Fort Pitt, but also wanted to sort of get their, basically a taste of this business. And so they partnered with William Trent, signing an venture agreement, basically saying he had free to enterprise whatever he wished to do. But their big thing was to open the largest store there in Fort Pitt. And at the time, the only other store larger than that was known as the King's Store, the commissary, that was run basically by somebody hired by those garrisoned at Fort Pitt. And this, as you can see today, this is the modern day, what's left of the Flag Bastion in downtown Pittsburgh, sort of the ramparts left of Fort Pitt. Just to give you an idea, you can see the buildings there, modern day of PPG and all that in the background there, right where at the point. So at this time, being that Trent was encased here, he survived several obstacles. In the winter of 1761, early 1762, a flood with the ice breaking devastated the lower town. There were two towns at the time at Fort Pitt, known as the lower town and the upper town. Trent's property was so big in the lower town, he had three different houses. Eventually, it was labeled on the census as number 34. He would have three different houses, one to house his store, another one for his residence. Him and Levi Andrew Levy ran. And a lot of it was damaged by this flood. Then eventually, when the Indians laid siege to Fort Pitt, due to their lack of gift giving from the order of the Commander-in-Chief of North America, General Amherst. And by doing so, the Indians sort of launched an insurrection at all the outposts there, from Fort Detroit to Fort Sandusky, to all those from Erie on, Fort Presque Isle, Fort Ligonier, Fort LeBoeuf, all these ones here. Fort Pitt was no different. They were led under siege. And at this time, with Trent being the most experienced, and it didn't help that his partner, Levi Andrew Levy, was captured by the Indians. The original commander, Hugh Crawford, of the militia was also captured. It left the commander of the garrison, Simeon Equier, to approach Trent. And on May the 29th, 1763, he became basically the garrison and commander of the militia. His second in command is Josiah Davenport, and this is the original signatures. If you want to get an up-close thing, I have a blown-up version of the copy of the original up front there at the table. But this is what was given in October 1763 to show that all their things were accurate and true. Like I said, you can see Trent's name at the top, Major, and then you can see Captain Davenport. He was promoted, believe it or not. He was originally a Lieutenant Josiah Davenport, and as you can see, you see the F in there. The F stands for Franklin. This is Josiah Franklin Davenport, the second in command under Trent, and Benjamin Franklin's nephew. And at this time, you can see other names. Alexander McKee, McKee's Rocks in Pennsylvania. One of the original first sites they tried to build a fort is named because of this also, who was the adjutant and lieutenant there at Fort Pitt under Trent. Um, but yeah, at this thing in 1763, Trent was always notorious too. I always like to bring this up that in 1746 in King George's, and even in 1754, and no different than in here, he had a reputation for enlisting questionable characters under his detachment. In 46, there would be advertisements all the time saying, there's a runaway or a criminal wanted by the law. They think he joined a regiment. He's probably under Captain Trent. And it was always it'd be in Philadelphia, it'd be Pennsylvania Gazette. And there were numerous ones of deserters. Where was he? He was in Trent's unit. Same thing came in the reputation of Trent called, Washington would call injurious to their expedition men under Trent that were Ohio Company employees. And this was no different. He hired recruits such as Simon Girty, of the later on fame, and also James Smith, the leader of the Black Boy Rebellion, were all in this regiment under William Trent at Fort Pitt when it was laid siege. Now, at this time in the 1760s, then, as Trent was trying to get back the debts that he lost in the French and Indian War, and then with this, what he called the late Indian War here at Fort Pitt, that lasted several months there by, this is, like I said, by the fall, is when his last thing was written here and he returned home to Carlisle. Eventually, he would be back to paying these men, but he wanted to get back these debts. And by doing so, they met in a treaty under Sir William Johnson, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. Go through here, you can see the names. This is the Fort Stanwix. This is in Rome, New York, present-day Rome, New York. It would be at this treaty at the time, considered the largest Indian treaty of the time in 1768. There were numerous. William Franklin, Trent's former friend and basically comrade from King George's War and other things, would attend this, as well as several other deputies. But it had close to 3,000 natives would attend this, and then it would have a cession of land from the Six Nations to make up for the debts that were given to those that were lost. And Trent had a list of men, or about 26, including himself, that wanted debts back from not only the French and Indian, but also this late Indian War. And by doing so, and it was mostly for the 1754 losses were eventually blamed to be from the French, so they weren't able to get those debts back, at least what was recovered at this treaty here. But eventually, the Six Nations would say that they would give back the debts and they would give their approval. So all he had to do was get the British Crown's approval, and they could handle this land that would be the same in value as what was owed. And by doing so, if they sold off these parcels of land, then eventually, hopefully, they could eventually get back the debts that was owed. At least at this time, by 1769, when Trent would sail to London to get it approved by the Crown and Parliament, him and Crone himself would be in debt almost to $1 million in today's money. So this is the original, I talked about Treaty of Stanwix. This is the original book that Trent kept the journal in, 113 pages. It's in Philadelphia. This is the original cover and everything. It was amazing to pull this out in Philadelphia and seeing that this is the exact book that was still intact, that he kept it at that time. This was the ship. Eventually, he would sail there by the June of 1769. He would sail then from Philadelphia. This is the ship he sailed on. This was the advertisement in Pennsylvania Gazette, the ship, the Betsy, and would sail to Bristol there to hopefully get all these papers taken care of. One of his partners in this to head over there, Samuel Larton from Philadelphia, would already be there a few months ahead and was waiting for Trent to arrive so that he and Trent could finally conduct this with Parliament. But unfortunately, the arrival was anything but easy travel. He would be delayed for a week, basically in Ireland, until basically the sea could calm down. Eventually would arrive in Bristol. He would take what he dictated as a flying machine. Now you read that in the original letter and you're going, what is he talking about? A flying machine, you think, was he a time traveler? What is this? But he's referring to this coach here that had springs on it that supposedly could get to Bristol and London in under 3 days, supposedly 2 days. As you can see, it was a genteel coach. If you could afford it, you could ride in it. And basically you could ride in here, or you could ride on top, though I don't know how safe the on top thing was, being how fast it ran up the time there. But he would eventually arrive May the 25th, 1769 in London. He would go to Charing Cross. If you visit London today, which I did doing the research here back in 2021, this statue of Charles I still resides in Charing Cross, and it would be the same one, the main hub of the center of London that everyone would see when they were coming in on a coach. But his first stop, he came to the Strand, which was the main drag from Charing Cross. He would go to Craven Street, which was the renter, Dr. Franklin, Dr. Benjamin Franklin. This is the picture I took. This is the parlor, the guest parlor where Trent would have been, right inside the house, Benjamin Franklin House in London, that he sat with Samuel Wharton and Benjamin Franklin. And his landlord, Margaret Stevenson, would also reside there a couple floors up and would serve them as they would discuss business and what they would do there in London as they were trying to get the final approval for this treaty. And it's ought to be known too in the as they arrived here, Trent would not only live, he lived pretty close to where Franklin lived. He originally lived on Villiers Street, which was only like an alleyway away from the actual where Franklin's house is today, 36 Craven Street in London. But he also would live 2 years in. He would rent off there in what was today known as Nassau Street. Back then it was known as New Suffolk Street. And then eventually live in the present day thing of what was known then as Norton Street. It's now Bolsover Street. All these residences were all former would be ones that William Franklin had knowledge of. So Franklin's son would eventually give these rentals to Trent on where to stay when he came to London. It shows and Franklin would also give money at that time to do so to fund this expedition, which originally they thought would last only a couple of months. He even wrote to his wife, Sarah, saying that he would be here maybe another month or so, 5 months in total. Eventually, 5 months turned into 6 years being stuck over there from 1769 to 1775. But originally, they would meet with Chairman Franklin, who would be in charge of this. They would entice 16 shareholders to meet the Crown and Anchor. This is an 1800 portrait. You can see the arrow was seen right at the corner there of the Strand and Arundel Street. This is St. Clement Danes, the church there as well. That's still standing today. But this is the main tavern. Supposedly, this is where the rebels met. The secret meetings were always notorious. I don't know how secret it was. We're knowing about it right now. But that was where everybody would meet of the time. He met there twice with Franklin and others, mostly members that were in London and also American constituents at the time. This is the modern day rendition of what this is. You can see the church there. And this would have been this corner. Ironically, it's not a tavern anymore. It's our version. It's their version of what was like a Panera Bread over there. So it's still a meeting place for people, but not what we inhabited back then. But it was hinted that at that time, as they approached Parliament, Trent would do all the writing of the letters. Franklin and Samuel Wharton would go to Parliament, and through the Board of Trade, Lawrence Hillsborough, they would present this. Now, at this time, it was only a few million acres. But Lord Hillsborough said, if you're really going to do a royal colony here and start one, why not make it bigger? How about he hinted at possibly 20 million acres? So at this time, they came back and Trent would write copies of letters in 1770, but it was also they were dragging their feet. There were tensions going on in the colonies right now. So the last thing the king is worried about is Americans trying to get a charter or colony while there's things breaking out. Trent would write about, you'd hear about tensions in Massachusetts, mentioning as the Boston Massacre would happen, as well as the Tea Party. So it would be things that would definitely play a role as they're trying to do this on this side of the water. So they would form what was known then as the Grand Ohio Company. And they called it that because George Mercer, who would be one of the eventual shareholders, was representing the Ohio Company. And when he realized he couldn't stand against Trent and the others, and Franklin, he bought into the Ohio Company. So the Grand Ohio Company was called this because it had American and English constituents. We always think about it at this time, especially in 1770, 71, that, tensions are rising in Great Britain. But a lot of these guys weren't worried about that. They were just trying to get what they were trying to get owed. So from the American side, you had, of course, Benjamin Franklin. This is Samuel Wharton. Of course, William Trent is the thing. Unfortunately, there's no actual painting or portrait. Although it's believed this thing here of Samuel Wharton, this wood dyed cut, was done when he was in London. So you have to wonder, did Trent have one done as well? And it's just never been found. But on the English side, you also had Thomas Walpole, former banker, and he was the head of the British East India Trading Company, John Frostcroft, and also Anthony Todd, this gentleman right here. He was the postmaster. He was basically London's postmaster. If there was somebody that was intercepting the letters and was reading them, it was him. And at that time, Trent would have dinner with him in Franklin, but there were times when he discussed the business, he only discussed this and not what was going on in the colonies. weary that there were eyes and ears everywhere, knowing of his English constituents. So he knew of being that this one had basically shares in the Grand Ohio Company, that he didn't want to take any chances. And this, as you can see, is one of the signatures of the letter at the time. Like I said, there wasn't really a portrait of Trent at the time, but showing his, his signature on all these letters. Trent would be the point that he would write so many letters in London for Franklin and Wharton that eventually he'd become blind in one eye because of it, working hours on end to a point that he had to take a break. And there was one point that they were asking about his health because he had lapses already with malaria when he was in the 1740s, and he had another relapse of it when he was in London. So in 1772, Trent and the rest of them got to do this. They visited the cockpit. It was the last known building from the Whitehall Palace. Today it's the Whitehall Road that goes through here in London. It was the last thing, the Whitehall Palace, that was run by Henry VIII. It burned in a fire in the 1690s. But this was the last standing building, and this is where they meet. It was called the Court of St. James. And it would be here that Benjamin Franklin, Walpole, and a friend of William Johnson named Reverend William Hanna would also come with Trent, Samuel Wharton, George Mercer, William Trent. They all addressed the Privy Council about their proposed charter. And it would be Trent that would say that the capital of this type thing, he suggested, at least at this point, that maybe move it from not necessarily Philadelphia or Williamsburg. Why don't we do it in Pittsburgh, where Fort Pitt is? It would be the center point of what their proposed colony would be. And it would be so important that in July the 4th, 1772, the Oxford Journal would report on it basically 3 days later. It would already, mention these petitioners that came through and were successful. Reverend Hanna would even describe it, saying that as a most extraordinary matter that he wrote to William Johnson, and in what no person had ever accomplished before. Being that in the time of what's going on in 1772, that these men were able to get at least initial approval of their proposed colony. And before they would attend this Court of St. James, this would be the part of a three-piece suit that Trent would have made while he was in London. It's still today, if you go to the William Trent House in Trent, New Jersey, they still have, this is the only surviving piece, this basically waistcoat or vest. It was made of silk, and they used, you can see a closer of this pocket here. The embroidery on this, they used foil in here, embroidered into the threads to make it look like metallic. It was made basically in the East End of London in Spitalfields by silk weavers, French silk weavers, and then eventually taken to tailors in London. As of him, Samuel Wharton, and even Benjamin Franklin all had silk suits made while they were in London to when they approached through the Court of St. James at that time. And this is from the article of the Oxford Journal talking about, and you can see Major Trent, Walpole mentioning what was going on, sort of reporting this. But as this happened, Lord Hillsborough was still hesitant. As much as they got the initial approval, he blocked it. He drug his feet on it. The unrest in the colonies, he did not trust the Americans at this point, especially not Dr. Franklin. So this is Lord Hillsborough. He did a portrait of him. And so he blocked it. And eventually this provided an outrage because, like I mentioned before, there were English constituents with this Grand Ohio Company. Some were even current members of Parliament. So they were not happy that their investment was getting blocked. So they basically organized a coup, and Lord Hillsborough was basically forced to resign. They brought in the Earl of Dartmouth, and if you're familiar with the Dartmouth College, that's what he's named for. But this gentleman here, they would force Hillsborough to resign. He would be replaced, and a day later, after the resignation and basically the initial thing of Lord Dartmouth, they approved the larger colony, which they at the time was named Pittsylvania. And that would last about a year. As sort of they had to move it on to basically Alexander Wedderburn to get the final approval. Basically, they wanted to make sure that it catered to what they were trying to do. Originally, it was named also once again by William Pitt, the former prime minister. But then they decided, maybe even more akin to this, with suggestions from the men on Parliament, it became then known as Vandalia. And this was to honor this woman here, Queen Charlotte. And by doing so, Queen Charlotte, it's believed, at least it was written in the letters from William Trent and Samuel Wharton and Thomas Wharton and those that were involved, said that she was descended from Vandalic tribesmen that lived in Southern Europe and Northern Africa. And by doing so, by naming this colony Vandalia, they could then give honor to her. And it appeased Parliament definitely for this. So at some time, it was by 1773, it would be changed. In fact, there's a letter that wrote a PS just to make sure. PS, the province is named Vandalia. It is not not Pennsylvania. So they wanted to make sure there was a reminder. This is at the bottom of one of the letters that Samuel Wharton would write home. But the Solicitor General, this gentleman here, Alexander Wedderburn, who eventually would become even more notorious here, also sort of drug his feet on this, didn't, basically things that were going on in the colonies. And it was because of what happened next. Letters were found from Governor Hutchison, supposedly previous letters written by Dr. Franklin, and he was brought before the court of St. James again, but not for the reasoning he wanted to be. He was ridiculed, he was basically made fun of, and was accused by Wedderburn of having basically committing treason. And by doing so, was stripped of his duties as Postmaster General. And they claim in 1774, as this is going down, this is when Benjamin Franklin realized it was time to stop trying to get things for the royal crown and time to think about independence. And by doing so, because of what happened here, decides to return there by the early summer of 1775. Trent would sign off on the final things, realizing that Wedderburn, he'd leave Samuel Wharton to hopefully get the final approval, and that they would just go back and claim and start beginning what they believed was Vandalia. And they believed so much that Samuel Wharton actually gave him a plan of a governor's house to build, and with gardens. He actually gave him seeds to Trent as well to start building at Fort Pitt. They were so sure that this was going to be built. But before Trent would leave, as danger started rising here, as we look at the year being that Trent would leave by April of 1775, Franklin would already be back at this point. By May of 1775, he would arrive back there with his grandson Temple and would eventually join the Second Continental Congress. Trent would eventually leave, but not before arriving back at Craven Street. Letters from Margaret Stevenson to Dr. Franklin, but also this thing right here, the restraining acts that had not been officially announced in the colonies yet, but had been in London and been passed by Parliament. Trent was able to smuggle the restraining acts that would restrict the trade in New Jersey and Pennsylvania before it would be officially announced even. So he had it on him as he sailed to London there in the April of 1775. Trent would eventually arrive back in June of 1775. But as he leaves London, he sails on this ship here. This is the advertisement, the Sally. He would sail there out of London. This is sort of a rendition, but the arrow here points to they left from the Custom House on the Thames, eventually set out through at the end of Gravesend, eventually come around to Portsmouth, where they would do one last stop before departing. But as they were there, it's been reported, at least from Samuel Wharton, handing a letter to Trent to smuggle back to Benjamin Franklin. There's aware that a spy supposedly is on board. This man, Philip Skene. It's written in the letter that supposedly he's the governor of Ticonderoga. And at this time, he has loyalties to Great Britain and wishes to eventually take troops back with him. But as they're on this ship ready to leave, they also spy the Cerberus and loaded up with His Majesty's troops. They're waiting for a favorable wind for Boston. In the same letter, they see with these troops, let's go back here. The troops are, the Cerberus would eventually take part in the siege of Boston at the attack on Bunker Hill. But on these ships would be three generals, and they would mention it: Howe, Lord Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. Were all getting ready in Portsmouth to sail to Boston. Before anybody knew what was going on, Trent and Wharton would spy them loading the Cerberus, heading to Boston, waiting for a favorable wind. They would eventually arrive there by June, and then lay siege to Boston right after Bunker Hill. But Trent would arrive, go back to his property. I told you at that point he would go back, visit his family there in Trenton. He would buy 700 acres at that point, just in South Trenton. This would be the survey in 1777 that he would live till 1784. But he would live a large plantation there, even operate a ferry. But in the meantime, he arrived in Philadelphia. The spy was arrested in Philadelphia. They took Philip Skene eventually to what was known then as the New Tavern, and eventually became known as City Tavern. If you're familiar with City Tavern Restaurant in Philadelphia, they used that to imprison him and two other officers who they questioned and eventually threw in jail. At that time, he smuggled the letters back. John Hancock and them questioned him, as well as John Adams. And when they had arrived on June 7, 1775, Wedderburn would eventually approve Vandalia in May of 1775, but shelved it. Basically said they wouldn't grant the charter until the American Revolution ended, which 1775, it's another 8 years before that would be into case here. So at the meantime, there was still what Trent called Indiana. This was the original grant from the Six Nations. They expanded to this. This is what they were suggested when they went to London. But this was the original grant from the Treaty of Stanwix, which was already promised to them, in which they had in writing from the natives, the Six Nations. So Trent would pursue at least the next 8 years of trying to get Indiana an approval. Unfortunately, this was also around the grants and different things that the men that fought in the French and Indian War, the Virginians, and backed by those in the Virginia Regiment, or Virginia Assembly, like George Washington and George Mason, and those that were not happy that the former, George Mason was the treasurer for the Ohio Company, was not happy that these bought into this Vandalia Company, which they were a part of. So this became struggles, and eventually Virginia would block it, and Trent couldn't buy the shares, the Indiana shares he was trying to sell. He would sell to John Paul Jones, different people over the next 8 years, but they were almost considered useless by the time of his death. He was trying to sell off what he could at the time to do this. And so by doing so, he could no longer, I showed you that property earlier, he couldn't afford this property here. There we go. Okay. He could not afford this property here, this 800 acres. At one point, he owed 12,000 pounds. I think it ended up was close to $8 million in today's money of what he owed in back taxes and different things to pay off this property here, this house. Eventually, he couldn't pay off his debts. Like I said, the losses amounted to millions. And eventually he had to sell off. He wrote in a letter, he had 7,500 acres in Cumberland County, including acres he had also in New York, and what his property was in New Jersey. And it still wasn't enough to pay for what he had owed, at least at this point, to do so. And unfortunately, past here, Trent would eventually move to Philadelphia, being that he was so much in debt, him and his wife. They sold off the house as a sheriff's sale almost. In the June of 1784, he would write his will. In July of 1784, fortunately, the house does not survive today. A year later, after Trent died, the house got caught fire during a lightning storm and eventually burned to the ground. So the property today is part of Riverview Cemetery, where notorious like John Roebling, the bridge builder, and different are buried in Trenton. But Trent himself was basically moved to Philadelphia and lived his final days with friends there at 4th Street, and would be laid to rest in what is believed to be Washington Square. There's close to 30,000 in this park today, as you can see. There's 30,000 at least Continental soldiers, and it was also where all the supposed men that were struggling in poverty, enslaved, were all buried in this area, especially not affiliated. And Trent at that point lived about a block or two from that square. And it's believed, it's possible he's probably buried there. He would die on December the 1st, 1784. And this is the sort of marks this today, and it sort of fits the thing here, freedom is a light, in which many have died in darkness. And it's amazing with the birth of America coming up here in the next 8 years of talking about our history, how these stories, men like Trent here, eventually are coming out to know that these were the builders and the foundation of what we know today as America. Trent was no different when it came to this, especially over what he did in his career. It's just a shame he would die penniless there in Philadelphia after having one point be on top of what he was trying to do. Thank you.